Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast, it's a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the hardest things to make sense of in the world is church abuse. As Christians, we believe the church is supposed to be different from the wider world. We believe, okay, maybe the world out there is filled with harmful actors and lies, but the church, well, it's supposed to be the place of safety and truth because Jesus is present in his body, right? But church abuse shatters that belief because with church abuse, we're confronted with the reality that the kinds of harm out there in the world also exist within the church. And the kind of lies told by secular institutions may also be being told by Christian institutions. So the reality of church abuse begs for more understanding of what's really going on. And the need to understand church abuse is why I'm so excited for our guest today, Mike Cosper. Mike is a leading figure in the world that has helped cast a light on the truth of church abuse. Mike produced and hosted The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, a podcast series which chronicled the nature of abuse that took place over years in a megachurch in Seattle called Mars Hill, led by a pastor named Mark Driscoll. Mike Cosper's expose has garnered over 30 million downloads, which is an extraordinary achievement. And that means for many, many, many millions of people, his podcast was a critical education in the nature of church abuse. Currently, Mike serves as the director of podcasts at Christianity Today, and he just came out with a book that's in some ways a follow-on to the Mars Hill story. The book is called The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. Mike, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Well, and you are back. And actually, I don't know if you know this, Mike, but you were the first outside guest of the Good Faith Podcast.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. So you were in the second episode. The first episode was just David and me, and we were discussing Liberty University and the nature of institutional abuse happened there. And then we followed that up with you as our first guest, which I think reflects an intuition that both David and I had that if we're going to make sense of the world out there, you have to start with making sense of what is happening in here in the church. So I wanted to ask you to articulate that connection. Like, why is it so important for Christians to turn this inward examination to what's happening in Christian institutions and churches, especially, please especially speak to people who may not be touched by that, may not have personal experience. Why is it important for them to be paying attention to this?
You know, I think that what we often do in the church is we often tell ourselves, well, things are different here because we're all Christians, right? We've got this common bond as Christians. We see the world differently. We believe in God. We believe in the resurrection. That should inoculate us from some of the things that are going wrong with the rest of our culture and the rest of our society. And frankly, is particularly the book that just came out. The book's called The Church in Dark Times. Particularly the book, I wanted to try to make this case that says, no, actually, culture's the water we swim in, and fish don't know they're wet. And in many ways, we have absorbed a lot of the same dangerous and bad and damaging ideas. And when you understand the things that lead to radical evil outside the church, it actually quickly shines a light on why otherwise very good people, very good, conscientious, Jesus-loving, neighbor-loving people find themselves complicit in some very evil things.
Well, and I think this is so true, and it affects all of us. I think the reality is if you are a listener, and even if you have not directly experienced some form of church abuse, almost certainly you are part of some denomination or network of churches where that kind of abuse has happened. And there's also a good chance your denomination or network didn't handle it very well. I would say there's at least a very strong chance of that. And so this really calls into attention Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 12, when he says, when one member suffer, all the members suffer with it. You could translate that to say, when one member is abused, all of the members are abused with it. And so I think this is why I think your contribution with Mars Hill and now this book is so vital for us to pay attention. Let's start by defining terms, Mike.
Sure. Because
church abuse can cover a lot of different types of phenomenon that we're all grouping into this broad category. Draw on the story of Mars Hills to illustrate the different dimensions of what we're calling church abuse.
Yeah, I think that's helpful to do, because there's some kinds of abuse that that operate in very well. Different kinds of abuse operate in very different ways. A lot of the scandals that have rocked the church in the last number of years have been about the cover up of child sexual abuse, or of other kinds of sexual abuse, manipulative sexual relationships, that sort of thing that happened inside the church. Mars Hill was not about that. Really at all. That was not a major factor in that story. It was not a major thing that took place in that church. There were certainly some gender and sexuality things that, were questionable, and we talked about those in the show, but that was not fundamentally the primary issue. The primary issue was really centered around power, around the idea that you had a leader who was sort of untouchable, unquestionable. Anytime you crossed the will of that leader, if you caught him on the wrong moment and the wrong day, that was the end of not just your job, but your livelihood, the end of your community. Oftentimes those who crossed paths with Driscoll in particular and came out on the wrong end of it. As one Mars Hill member put it to me, when you leave, you're dead. No one talks to you. My friends didn't call me for over a year. And so that's a different dynamic. And it really is about, it's almost like sheep and goats. It's like all of a sudden you become one of the goats. You are cast out. And the effects of that psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, they kind of can't be overstated.
Well, and in particular, the dimension of that happening in the church adds this extra dimension, because that kind of abuse we would call leadership abuse, or emotional abuse, relational abuse, that if you are familiar with life in secular institutions, that happens.
Right.
But there's something about when that happens, and it happens at the hands of a spiritual leader, it takes on an extra dimension of toxicity and damage. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of where the term spiritual abuse has been coined, to capture this extra dimension of when you marry this abuse of power with spiritual power. Right. Say more about what Mars Hill showed about this extra dimension of spiritualized abuse.
Yeah, there's this, it's funny, we're, as Protestants, we don't think of our pastors as priests, but there's still a dimension in which they function as priests. And there's still, in every denomination and every tradition, there's a certain sense of authority that lands on the shoulders of the person who stands up front and says, "Thus saith the Lord." Particularly at Mars, Mars represented part of the evangelical movement that really did center the sermon, really centered the pastor, and really conveyed a lot of authority implicitly and explicitly, but I think most powerfully implicitly, conveyed a whole lot of authority around the person who's up front. So when you find yourself, I think one of the best ways to think about this is when you're sitting in a staff meeting and your boss is yelling at you, and it's the same guy who on Sunday is standing behind the pulpit and yelling at you and saying, "Thus says the Lord." Yeah. That hits very differently, because you have a certain way of relating to that person. Mars is also an example. This is very common in megachurches. Megachurches tend to hire from within. And so what you have on the staff is you have people who sort of come up into leadership from the pews. So they know that person as the voice of God, the voice of spiritual authority, long before they know him as a boss and mentor or as an abuser. So it's hard to dial back that sense of authority. It's hard to differentiate all of that. And I think, it's probably a topic for another day, but I think it raises questions about how do we treat the pulpit, and how do we treat those who go behind the pulpit, and what is expected of them, and what kind of authority
let's
do we
make
give them
that day today, Mike. Let's make that day today,
Yeah.
because I think this is an important topic, right? Because especially churches in general, but I think, as you're pointing out, mega churches, right, their business model requires them to self-select for a leader that is going to have a certain level of charisma, of personal power, both from the pulpit and leadership. We're looking for these kind of strong leaders. And therefore, it seems like it's very risky, because then you're how do you discern whether you're getting people who can wield that kind of power in a spiritually healthy way versus in a spiritually unhealthy way? What are some lessons that you've learned as you've looked at both Mars Hill, but also a number of examples? I know, people go to you with all sorts of examples because your podcast so touched a nerve. What are the patterns you're emerging of? How do we discern which leaders ought to be entrusted with authority?
Well, I think one thing that's certain to me is that every church needs to make sure that authority has its limits. And I think that's one of the things, one of the most significant moments in the life of Mars Hill comes, and I talk about this actually in the book as well. It comes at this point where they are revising their polity and essentially stripping the elders of governing authority and relegating that to a small group of executive elders, which was basically Mark and 3 or 4 guys who worked for Mark. That concentrated power in a really profound way. One elder had concerns about it. He talked to another elder about it. He shared those concerns, and they raised them with the leaders, and it was the end of their time at Mars Hill. And it was really a transformative, especially for a man named Paul Petrie. It was really a destructive moment in his life for him and his family. So, but I think it gets to this issue, which is, how much authority do you vest in a single individual? What are the ways in which you hold those people accountable? I think the other reality with this is there are pastor leaders who have that kind of, they've got that charisma, but they've also got the instincts to lead, where they can be kind of the CEO guy. You've the Rick Warrens, right? Like the kind of pastor as CEO and as torchbearer and as everything else. There are those people out there, and God bless them, and God uses some of them, and those things go great. But I often think about, there's an analogy in management that they talk about, where they say one of the mistakes that a lot of companies make is they get a really great salesman, and he does really well, and he earns big, and they promote him into management, and he knows nothing about managing people. It's not that he can take what he does and turn 4 other salesmen into him. He just knows how to sell, and he's really good at it. So they take this great salesman, they promote him into this management role, and he fails. And then they're like, well, what's wrong with this guy? Well, what's wrong is you put him in the wrong spot. I think about that with pastors all the time. Pastors are good at certain things that can draw a crowd, that can grow a church, they can inspire, they can do all of these kinds of things. And because of the pastor as CEO model, there's this expectation that as the church grows, the responsibilities on that guy's or that woman's shoulder, those are supposed to grow with him, so that they are then in charge of everything, soup to nuts. And I think I think that the history proves time and again that that's a bad decision. And in fact, a lot of wise pastors who lead very large churches, and Tim Keller talked about this often, was they made sure that there came a point where they got themselves out of, quote unquote, running the church, because they understood that was not what God had called them to or gifted them for.
This idea of, institutional design, really, you're talking about, is how do you design an institution that doesn't concentrate all of your power and, responsibilities and expectations onto one person. It is a question of institutional design. And it makes me think that there's this other aspect of church abuse, which is the institutional aspect of it, right? It's the institutional abuse, because generally in these abuse situations, there's the actual abuse itself, whether it was sexual, emotional, or spiritual, that somebody inflicted on somebody else or a group of people. Mm-hmm. Then there's the institutional response to when that is being uncovered a little bit, discovered, when issues are being raised. And that's like a secondary level of abuse that is like, salt in the wound when the institution does not respond the way a healthy institution would. Can you speak to that and how you saw that again in Mars Hill and other situations you've witnessed?
Yeah. So this is really the heart of the book, right? So it's, again, to go back to that Paul Petrie story, it's one thing for Driscoll and Petrie to have conflict. Yeah. It's another thing for 22 elders to unanimously vote to punish Petrie for really having done nothing wrong. Something that a decade later they all essentially came out and admitted to after the church had fallen apart. So how does that happen? I think it happens a couple of ways. I think the most significant thing, though, is that I think churches, what I argue in the book is that churches find themselves adopting sort of an evangelical ideology. And what it is it sort of sounds like the gospel. It's definitely borrowing a lot of capital from the gospel. The gospel's often in there, and the gospel's a beautiful subversive thing that does its work in the midst of all kinds of weird circumstances. But what it generally tends to be is it tends to be this story that the church is telling about how they are part of the redemption of all things. And one of the things that makes abuse possible in the church is that we have this incredibly powerful and important story that we're telling. Like, what we do is a matter of heaven or hell for people. And we're in the business of saving souls. And so if the church is being successful and you're seeing baptisms and you're hearing these stories, then when someone comes along and says, hey, there's a real problem here, it's incredibly tempting to go, what do we do? How can we possibly minimize the damage of this thing so that the story goes on, so that the redemption of our city, the redemption of our world continues? Because we don't want to be responsible for derailing that thing. Even though our pastor may have gotten this one wrong, there may be some problems here. If we can squelch this and minimize it and cast this person aside, with minimal damage, then we can the mission advances, the mission continues. It really hurts people to do this. It's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly damaging. It's morally corrupting, because you're allowing the ends to justify the means when the means themselves are lying, manipulating, they're damaging, they're destructive, and something Jesus would never have stood by for, and I think speaks to in many ways.
So there's an interesting logic that goes on, right? Because I think we would say that when an abuse has happened in an institution, we all agree this shouldn't happen. Right. And yet there's this strong temptation to say, this shouldn't happen, so let's not talk about it. Let's not expose it. Let's not bring it to the light, because this shouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. Versus, no, this shouldn't happen, which is precisely why we need to talk about it, why we need to expose it, why we need to deal with it. And at the heart of why you take this path seems to be essentially this misunderstanding that somehow the gospel, God's work that this is all supposed to be about, is going to get hindered if this gets exposed versus it getting exposed, right? Like that actually the exposure of harm and wrongdoing within the church is part of the gospel going forward. But that's very hard, I think, for us to grasp. Can you illustrate how that's actually the truth, how the exposure of harm, far from being something that actually harms the advance of the gospel, actually is part of its advance?
Yeah, let me say two things about it. First, I think one of the things that it reveals is that it reveals the extent to which we are modern people. We are children of the Enlightenment in this sense, because we believe in a gospel that's mysterious and that's spiritual and it's providential, and we don't have insight into exactly what God is doing or whatever. However, we confess that, but the way we operate is in a very, very materialistic way. We are very convinced that our growth strategies and our plans and our excellent production on Sundays and our social media strategy is the thing that's going to advance the kingdom of God above all else. And so what happens is when conflict emerges, or when abuse is uncovered or something like that, that threatens the good working order of our well-designed materialistic spiritual system. And so that's why we react the way we do. That's why people rush to cover it up, because they want to keep the machine operating. What's interesting in the Bible, of course, is that there are so many examples of leaders of, Old Testament, New Testament, leaders getting things wrong. I mean, it's remarkable to me that in the scriptures themselves, we have the story of Paul confronting Peter because Peter was showing favoritism in the church, which was not a small thing for a fledgling church, that Peter was doing that. Like, that was a real problem. The idea of favoritism kind of shows up again and again, starting in the book of Acts. the the final book of the Bible involves these 7 letters to the 7 churches, where Jesus is saying, you're getting these things wildly wrong. And to the church in Ephesus, like, you've lost your first love, and I'm about to take your lampstand away. In a sense, that's a story. It's like you've got the book of Ephesians, and then you've got this letter from Jesus, and it's almost as if it's the story of the decline and failure of a church. That's right there in the heart of our Bibles. And obviously 2,000 years later, we're still here. Something worked out, right? Like, providence worked out. It wasn't dependent on any one church or one leader or anything like that. I think there's a certain faithlessness that accompanies all of this, both in the way we approach ministry in such a materialistic way, and in the way that we have no confidence that, one crisis, one little problem is going to derail what God is up to.
Mike, I think that's such an important point, because it's true. When you read the Gospels, the New Testament, there's no cover-up happening there for the leaders. There's no burnishing of the leader's reputation. James and John are rebuked as get behind me, right. Saying Peter is rebuked in that same way. The scandals that Paul's epistles reveal about what's happening in the church. It does seem like the narrative of Scripture is, hey, the evils, the harms, the sins, the foibles that exist in the world are going to be present in the church. That's not what you should expect, that this place is going to be completely free of human sin. It's going to be full. It's that we have resources to deal with it, not to prevent it from ever occurring, but to actually respond to it. And that seems to be where, as you said, in the modernist impulse to control, we've substituted the reliance on the Spirit to deal with the harm that gets exposed to saying, let's do a PR campaign to actually make sure that never gets revealed. And that's how we're going to put a control and lid on it. And that is in such a violation of the very nature of the gospel narrative. And it seems to me then, Mike, is that not one answer to the confusion that people wrestle with who have gone through or touched church abuses? They say, how could this have happened? Their faith is so shaken by it. It does seem to call into question, well, what was your faith? What was the content of that faith in the first place? Doesn't it?
I think so. I mean, I think what happens, I think for most people who are the victims of that abuse, they're not all like, let me put it this way. I think for most people who are victims of that kind of abuse, they find themselves asking that question because they feel the reality of the situation. Like, they feel the injustice. They know they've been wronged. Their conscience isn't going to be convinced otherwise by the PR campaign or anything else. And so what they experience is they see this community that just keeps going, and everything seems to be fine, and everybody's buying the other story, and they're feeling cast out. But they know what the truth is, and that discontinuity leaves them really, really deeply spiritually disoriented. And as one person told me, it was like discovering, like, oh, we're not all playing the same game here, because the truth doesn't matter to you the same way that the truth matters to me. And so that's what leaves people feeling really troubled. And I think oftentimes it's what's so unfortunate in these situations is that they make the mistake of casting the blame upstream to God himself, to God, to the scriptures, to the concept of the very concept of the church, rather than sort of insisting on, no, actually the problem is this community that's abandoned its fundamental principles.
Right. And we were told by God through the scriptures that this was going to happen, and we need to be prepared for that. Mike, I want to connect the dots here about why that podcast on Mars Hill, it got such popularity, it got such attention. It was first of all, it was so well produced, so well researched, well executed. But let's face it, there's a lot of well-produced, well-executed podcasts that don't get 30 million downloads. Clearly, you touched a nerve. People were primed to get something that made sense of this experience. What I find interesting is, though, it's not just that the audience was primed for this story, but in many ways, you were primed for this story. Your own history prepared you such that your nerves are ready to receive the
Right.
story and make sense of it. Can you tell the audience your own personal story and how that led to
Sure.
your ability to perceive what was going on and realize that there was an important story here?
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in the church. I grew up in, kind of grew up in mega churches in the South at, my early days. I always tell people I was baptized at 8 years old by Ed Young Jr. at Second Baptist of Houston. It doesn't get much more mega church than that, I think. And then, we moved to Southern Indiana a few years after that, and was in a small church that became a mega church while we were there as well. And by the time I was out of high school, I found myself in this interesting place with a bunch of my Christian friends. None of us had a real spiritual home at that point. There'd been some conflict at my church. There'd been some conflict at a church where a good friend of mine had been the youth minister and he'd been let go. And we started gathering in an apartment and praying and just asking, God to tell us what we were supposed to do next. One thing led to another, and we got introduced to a guy who wanted to plant a church in the neighborhood we were gathering, and we became part of that church plant. Church was called Sojourn. We launched in September of 2000, and I came on staff just a few months after that as kind of mostly overseeing worship in the arts, but like it's church planting, so you cook till the cook shows up, and end up doing a little bit of everything over the years. And man, it was an incredible experience. I was on staff for 15 years. We grew to be a church of a little less than 4,000 people, 4 locations. We were expanding to 6 when I was when I transitioned off the staff, and saw the good, bad, and ugly of that world and that experience. And part of that for us was, some similar issues. They were different. The personalities were very different, and the specific conflicts were different, but similar kinds of conflict to what took place in Mars Hill. That led to me burning out and ultimately exiting the church. And like a lot of people who had that experience, I spent a long time going, what happened? Like, how did we get here? How do I understand what was here? How do I separate the parts of this that were so good and important and meaningful to me from the parts of this that were so incredibly hurtful and, have left me so profoundly rattled? And along the way, I remained connected to that church. I'm actually still a member of that church now. That pastor was ultimately kind of went through a similar process and was ultimately let go. And, in the aftermath of that, we had a lot of conversations among the former staff and current staff to try to make sense of that. We were also part of a church planting network where there were a couple of guys involved who were former Mars Hill pastors. And so we heard some of those conversations too. And it led me, I think it was probably as early as 2019, talking to one of those guys and saying, someone should really do the inside story of what happened at Mars, because I think it's way more common an experience than people realize. And surprisingly, he was like, yeah, I think I would be up for it. The guy's name's Aaron Gray. He's all over the podcast. And so I had this idea floating around for, a couple of years. And when I came on at CT, I pitched it to the folks there, and we rest is history, I suppose.
I want to talk about what you just said a moment ago about your own personal process of separating out what was from God, what was good, versus what was an abuse of power, what was human ideology and authoritarianism, that terms that you write about in your book. Give guidance to people who are needing to do that.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Because we live experience as a holistic thing. It's very hard for us to separate out, a conversion experience or a healing experience. Say, oh, that was good, and God, that wasn't. Like, what is that process of separating and culling like?
Okay, so I hate being this guy, but I'm going to say, well, I actually wrote another book about that.
Okay, be that guy.
But so I actually have a memoir where I talk about this. It's a book called Land of My Sojourn that came out about a year ago. And the answer to the question is a really unsatisfying answer, which is basically, I went to the desert and it was really hard. And I can't really tell people what to do to get out of the desert, except that you kind of have to for me, it was a lengthy process of learning to grieve. And this was something that, I sat with probably 3 or 4 different therapists over a period of 4 or 5 years. And almost every therapy session would basically end with the same thing, with one of them looking at me and saying, this is good. These things you're talking about, these are good. You need to learn to grieve these. And I didn't know what they meant. And I think what I found myself doing so much in the aftermath of my church experience was I kept looking at the present and saying, if we just realigned these things here, or maybe if this thing happened there, or if we could get this person to do this, or if this person left or whatever, I kept imagining scenarios that would get me back to the feeling that I had in 2005 or 2010, when things were just really rich and really good. And I realized that was longing for a place that no longer existed, that it was also longing for a reality that wasn't real. Because there were problems back then too. They weren't as bad as they became later, but there were always problems. And I think that ultimately it was kind of recognizing that there's something poisonous to nostalgia.
Yeah. And
that grief really did mean letting the past be the past, and recognizing that the present was going to have to be different, and we would always be different. That was the healing thing for me. And it, to your question, it really unlocked this idea that that once I stopped trying to recreate the past, I could start to actually assess the past for what it was. Mm-hmm. And I could appreciate the things that, as a musician, we did some things in the church. We made some music, we made some records, we did some things that I take an incredible amount of pride in. And there are moments of just worship and community and friendship that are, there'll be moments that I reflect on my deathbed and reflect on with a lot of joy. But there's also a lot of moments of grief, and I think that was the other part of it. And this is also, I think, really important for people. Sorry to go on so long. This is really important for people who have experienced abuse. It's one of the hardest things is naming what happened to you, is naming, this person lied to my face and it was wrong. And I think that getting to the place where I could look at some of the things that took place to me and go, no, it's not just that there was a miscommunication or there was this, that. It was like, no, this was straightforward lying and manipulation, with malice. And naming that was really painful because it made the offense of it more painful. But not naming it left it unsettled. If that makes sense.
It does. It makes me think again about this general point that we tend to think that the encounter with sin, abuse, harm is something that contradicts the gospel versus actually wrapped up in the gospel, which is, again, why we want to cover it up, deny that it happened. Or in the case of, if it did happen, we don't want to deal with it. We want to move on. We don't want to actually grieve it. But actually going through the abuse and the harm is part of the gospel. Like, we have to remember that is the gospel narrative itself. It is God himself in Jesus coming in to take on and go through it, go through all of the abuse, to go all through the betrayal, institutional betrayal of the highest kind. And so if we're going to follow Jesus, it does mean following his way through it, through the desert, like you said, through the abuse, through the naming of the wrong that's happened. It's really hard work. It is the work of the cross. It is picking up our version of the cross, to bear and recognize the evil that is present in the world. And it forces us to recognize, the gospel is not some magic fairy dust that we sprinkle over the world to such that we are now therefore exempt from evil and harm and sin.
Yeah. All right. And I'll just tag on to that briefly, that I think the other thing that happened for me as I came to understand my story was it unlocked the gospel in a lot of new ways. And in particular, it unlocked, for me in particular, it unlocked the story of Peter in really profound ways. And I look at Peter, we always, like, preachers love to sort of punk on Peter for all the things, being impulsive and all the rest of it. But what I look at it now is there's so many ways in which you look at Peter, and he He thought he knew what was going on.
Mm.
He was also profoundly naive in certain ways. And he becomes who he becomes ultimately because he was so naive, because he got so many things wrong, because he denied Jesus 3 times on the night of his crucifixion and had this night of misery, this dark night of the soul kind of experience that we see reconciled at the end of the book of John. And part of what that accomplished for me was it made me recognize, like, oh, the suffering of all this, the disillusionment, that's just a normal part of the Christian life. Like, I think probably everybody has to go through some season like that.
Yeah.
And if we don't normalize it, it actually incentivizes people to deconstruct, because if disillusionment and disappointment isn't normal, then they go, well, this has no place in the church. I've got to find a tradition, a spirituality that makes room for my disappointment and disillusionment. I think that's a massive disservice we do to Christians.
I think that's right. I love that concept of normalizing the yucky parts of the gospel story, right?
Yeah.
Like for me, my version of this is when I went through my version of this, which involved betrayal by some people very close to us. There was a moment, a light bulb that clicked for me. It was like, oh, this is why Jesus had to be betrayed. Like that was not a throwaway accident. That was
right.
A crucial part of the story of Jesus. If Jesus was going to take on the full nature of human sin, it meant being betrayed, because there's something about sin that is most expressed in the nature of betrayal, which is because of sin is a betrayal of God. And then therefore a betrayal of us to each other, of the promises and covenants and expectations we have of one another. And so to see betrayal as actually part of the story, part of the story of the cross, therefore part of our story that we're inevitably are going to go through and have to suffer through. That was my version of that. It's like, okay, this is why that story had to be part of it. And this is now part of my story. All right, we're here with Mike Cosper. He's the author of the book, The Church in Dark Times. We're talking about the darkness of church abuse and how then does the church respond to the darkness of the betrayal, of the abuse, the cover-ups, the just mishandling of power. Mike, clearly you weren't done with this, wrestling with this question after Mars Hills, because you could have imagined, after spending so much time and effort producing this really masterpiece of an expose, going on many podcasts and promoting it. I don't know, if I were you, I'd be like, okay, I'm done with this topic. It's something new. But you weren't done, because something in you still was needing to explore, to ask some more questions that produced this book. Tell us, what was it really what prompted and drove you to write this book, even after already covering this topic so thoroughly?
Yeah, the podcast really focused on telling the story and putting the listener in the shoes of the people who were kind of closest to the center of it and witnessed it, and here witnessing sort of their disillusionment and all of that as well. I spent less time on the podcast doing the sort of meta-analysis. And, there's a line in the opening, there's a line in one of the early versions of the show, the opening credits, where Jen Smith asks, why does this keep happening? And that question, her asking that question, has always haunted me. Even after the show was done and finished, it felt like I hadn't answered that question entirely. And there's an episode of the show called State of Emergency, where we look at the Paul Petrie story, and I make reference to this German Jewish social theorist from the 20th century named Hannah Arendt, and she talks about how one of the ways a dictatorship functions, a political dictatorship functions, in order for them to seize power, they have to declare a state of emergency. And what I talked about on the podcast was this idea that there's a way in which, when a church is having success, they turn the mission into sort of a perpetual state of emergency. So, like I said earlier, like, souls are dying, people are going to hell, and we're saving them. And so it kind of gives this permission structure to suspend all the rules and do whatever we need to do in order to keep the mission going. And I was always convinced that was kind of kind of a key to understanding the whole phenomenon at a deeper level. And so I'm a huge fan of Hannah Arendt. She's on the wall behind me here smoking. And her thought has just always been fascinating to me, making sense of the modern world. And I couldn't get away from kind of her voice in my head as a way of making sense of the evils that emerge inside our churches, where, you know, her focus was on Nazi Germany and why did ordinary people become part of the death camps, and why did they turn on their neighbors, and all the rest of it. She fled the Nazis for her life multiple times, and so she was obviously quite haunted by it herself. And so, to be clear, I mean, I say this very clearly in the very beginning of the book. I am not saying that abusive megachurches are Nazis. I'm not saying Mark Driscoll is Hitler by any means. Like, nothing like that takes place in the book. But where I think it's an interesting case study, and where I think it has application, is that people believed they were part of a movement that was changing the world for the better. Mm-hmm. And that belief allowed them to justify committing atrocities. What takes place in the church is, again, on a scale much different than what we were talking about with totalitarian government or whatever. But the architecture of power and the logic of the evil that unfolds is very, very much the same. And the more I looked at that, the more compelled I was by that, and the more it made me think, gosh, this is something I don't hear people talking about this nearly enough. And yeah, ultimately led to the book.
Well, one dynamic you talk about in the book, like you just said, was this state of emergency, we're part of some incredibly important mission in the world that justifies all of these abuses. But there's another one that you also write about in the book that I wanted you to talk a little bit about, which is the banality of evil, like the ways in which it's not actually something extraordinary. It's just everything's reduced to something kind of very ordinary. And this, I think, gets to the puzzle that happens around abuse at all scales, which is, well, why didn't anybody do anything about it? Why did people that otherwise you would think are moral, upstanding, faithful Christian folk, how do they just allow it to happen? And that's really kind of another part of that puzzling question that, especially for the victims, is also this part of ongoing damages. Is it's not just the people who did it to me. It's not even just also the leaders that covered it, but it's all the other members of this institution that seem to be okay with it.
Right.
So can you speak to that dynamic?
Yeah. It's one of the most fascinating parts of Arendt's story, actually. So in 1950, she published a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she kind of traces how, you know, Nazi governments come into being and all this. And she ends that book referring to what took place in the Holocaust as radical evil. It's a reference to something from Kant, and it's this idea, this sort of unprecedented, monstrous evil that we can't fully comprehend is what's at work here. Well, then 11 years later, the Israelis abduct Adolf Eichmann from Argentina, and they take him to Jerusalem to stand trial, and the New Yorker sends her to cover it. And when she gets there, you know, she had pled with the New Yorker to send her, because she's like, I've never met an SS officer. I want to see him defend himself. I want to hear his logic. I want to hear it all in his words. And she gets there and she's shocked, not because Eichmann, which the prosecution was making Eichmann out to be this monster, you know, mass murderer and all of this. She sees him and she listens to him and she reads the transcripts of his interviews and goes, this guy is a careerist and a buffoon and kind of stupid. And yet Eichmann was responsible for coordinating all of the transportation that took people from ghettos to the death camps in the East, and was literally responsible for the deaths of millions of people. So how did she reconcile these two phenomena, the monstrosity of the evil itself and this careerist buffoon sitting in front of her who spoke, you know, she says at one point, she says he only knew how to speak in stock phrases and cliches. He'd never had an original thought. And so that's where this phrase, the banality of evil, comes about, because what she was most compelled by when she saw Eichmann in person was that this was a person who was utterly thoughtless. And it was his thoughtlessness that made him complicit, that made him ideal to be complicit with all that went along. And I think that is such a profound insight for us, because I think this is true. And I think this is true not just, you know, by hunch, but also from the reporting. I think the vast majority of people who are inside of church leadership rarely take the time to think about what they're doing, to question what's happening, to make any kind of assessment or judgment about what leaders are doing and why they're doing it. The assumption is that we're all playing the same game, that we're all on the same team. We all want the same things. And the idea that perhaps some people are in this for very different reasons with very different motivations, it rarely crosses the mind until something utterly jarring happens to you, and now you can't make sense of it at all.
I think that's so true. One of the funky things about if you've experienced church abuse yourself and then start connecting the dots with other stories, and inevitably that happens, it's how remarkably similar they are. I mean, of course, everyone is distinct and unique, and there's some individual, but the patterns are just very pretty. It's not a very creative phenomenon. It's some very sort of similar things. And one of the, it reminds me of the banality of evil, that like evil is not very creative. Evil can only distort and deform what is actually there. And it only has a few moves it can make each time to deform and distort. And some of those moves, like you said, is it preys on thoughtlessness. I think it preys on just general moral weakness and lack of courage, because usually it would take some level of courage to stand up to and name these things. And that's the missing ingredient, and that allows a lot of this abuse to perpetuate. It's the thoughtlessness combined with the cowardice, I think, that I see over and over again. And then again, some institutional design things which allow a leader to concentrate power, to select people who will hold him accountable. It's kind of boring in a strange way the more and more you delve into church abuse. And I think it gets to this very phrase, the banality of evil.
Well, and one of the things she says too, she says part of the discovery was the reality that evil itself has no substance, that when evil manifests and we try to make meaning from it, it's a fool's errand. Because it is fundamentally, it is an empty thing. It is a hollow thing. It's the absence of meaning. It's the opposite of meaning in a sense. Right. And I just think for one thing, I think that's just a profoundly biblical idea that meaning is the absence, like evil is the absence of God, the absence of the good, the absence of meaning and purpose. It is fundamentally destructive. And because of that, it's fundamentally hollow and empty.
Right. Which is why that, haunting question that abuse presents, why does this keep happening? The question you referenced, why does this keep happening? At one level has an answer, and at another deeper level doesn't have an answer, right? It keeps happening because of the nature of sin, that it keeps replicating itself over and over again in these banal patterns. And we are not immune from sin just because we exist in a church. That's at the most immediate, proximate level to answer, why does this happen? But that doesn't really answer that deeper existential level. That is the really haunting nature of that question, why does this happen? Because at that level, there is no answer, because you're really asking, make this make sense for me. Make evil sensible to me. And the nature of evil, I think, is what you're saying, is it is unsensible. It is empty. It is devoid of any possibility of meaning making. And so at the deepest existential level, the deepest question we ask in abuse, and that abuse presents to us in the church context, I think it isn't why does this keep happening, but rather who is in it with us. And then that we only, the answer is, of course, Jesus at the bedrock of it, but also other people. Like, I don't think any of us can go through and recover from abuse alone. Can you say more about how people who go through this, how they need each other, how they need podcasts like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, why they need a book like The Church in Dark Times? Why is community a key part of this response pattern?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need someone who's standing next to us going, you're not the crazy one. Like because I mean, even on one level, I mean, that's a tactic of abusive people, is to make you feel like you're crazy, you're imagining, or you're exaggerating, or it's not as bad as you think it is, or whatever. I mean, that's just a really, really common and really destructive pattern in and of itself. I think as well of, I think a lot about Jesus on the cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Like whatever that phrase means, and obviously there's, better theologians than me have written a lot about it, but whatever that means, I do think part of it is the experience of that loneliness, the experience of that sense of isolation, the experience of that emptiness of evil consuming your life, which is what I think abuse victims often feel, that incredible sense of isolation, that incredible sense that they're on their own. As Tim Keller would often say, like, Jesus was left alone and isolated and abandoned so that we never would be, and that he fundamentally will always be with us in that. And I mean, to me, that's the real tragedy of abuse, is if it sends people into a place where they don't believe that Jesus is with them in any of these things. I think trying to make meaning without the sense of a savior who suffers along with his people is I don't know how people do it. I mean, I'm sure they do, but I don't know how they do it. And again, it highlights as well just how profoundly tragic it is that this stuff happens in the church.
Right, because the abuse not only causes you that experience of wrong, harm, damage, but in the spiritual context, in the church context, it risks cutting you off from the very salvation that God has designed to heal, to respond, to care for you in that very state. It's like throwing you in the ocean and then pulling the safety preserver away with it.
Right.
Mike, this task, this vocation, calling of peering into the church in dark times seems to have been placed on you, both through the Mars Hills podcast, through the number of the books you've written on this. What's next for you in this calling?
Yeah, so we're turning to Satanism, actually. For
you're just getting, you just don't have enough darkness in your life, do you, Mike?
Yeah, so we've got a podcast coming in the next few weeks called Devil in the Deep Blue Sea, and this will be an ongoing series where each season we kind of dive deep into a single story. And the first story we're looking at is the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. What happened there? Why did it happen? What was the effect of it? What were the cultural and social things going on around it that shaped the church? And in many ways, I think reveal a lot about where we are today and why we are where we are today. So, yeah, look for that. The trailer's out. You can if you just search in your podcast app, you'll find it. You can subscribe to it so that you can listen to the trailer and then get the first episode when it drops in a few weeks.
Okay, well, we'll put links in that show notes. My last question to you, Mike, is a personal one, because I'm really struck listening to you is that you're still going there. You're still going to the dark places, even some of the darker places now. I do know people who that is somehow they're calling. Well, actually, I should say, given everything we've talked about, that's the calling on all of us as Christians, as followers of Jesus. We go to the desert, we go to the cross, we go to the dark places. You've especially been on this journey. Can you give some advice to people who are trying to be faithful to that they're being called to some dark places? What are the practices? What are the things we need to have place in our lives so that we're able to go there?
Yeah. Well, I'm coming into this interview off of a 2-week vacation where I really unplugged. I didn't read the news. That was a weird experience for me as somebody who lives and breathes journalism. I haven't unplugged that much in a long time. And I feel really convicted that I probably should be unplugging like that on a more regular rhythm, for sure. I mean, the truth is that it's my vocation is certainly not for everybody, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. I think there are certain temperamental things that make it work for me, and there's also communal things that make it work for me. I've got people I can call when I get really discouraged and despairing. I've got, some of them are colleagues, some of them are friends. And it can be a really discouraging thing. But, to quote Tim Keller again, I remember a sermon from him years ago where he talked about what does it mean to be salt? We're supposed to be called salt. And he talked about salt as a preservative, and you used salt, like salt goes into spoiling places. That's where it belongs. And I think about that often when I think about some of the work that we do. We go to these dark stories, we go to these dark places, and we try to preserve what life is there. We try to bring it out. We try to bring it to the light, and so that, for sure, I think that there's something unique to my vocation for that. And like I said, I don't wish it on anyone, but I think at the same time, I think there's reason to have confidence, for me, because I believe in the resurrection and because I believe in the restoration of all things. I can weather a lot of the dark stuff that I hear in these stories, because I know that there is justice, that there's the judgment of God and the redemption of God yet to come, that'll reconcile it all in Christ.
Well, amen to that. I can't think of a better ending to this podcast. Mike, thank you for the work you've done over the years to cast light on this important topic of church abuse. And thank you for this most recent book, The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Curtis. Good to be here.
And listeners, we will once again gather next week as we gather together because we need each other to make sense of the world. And we will once again be around the campfire.